This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm going to be talking about Agents of Reason, which is the book that I've published here, and I've published it myself. And a little bit of the next book that I'm writing, which is called Tom and Edmund, after Tom Paine and Edmund Burke. I get a little bit of biography just by way of letting you into how I've come to write it in the way that I've come to write it. Since I've been in academia, which is only about 25 years or so, I left, got kicked out of school when I was 15 and left, and I'd sort of hit the off button for education when I was about 13 years old. I just kind of rejected it. It always seemed a bit intimidatory and fraudulent to me. But when I've crawled back into academia, I've been a sort of like an academic odd job man in many ways. I've taught for 23 years for the OU. I've done bits here and bits there, and for the last about 7 years I've made a reasonable living at the University of York, where I was until September provost of one of the colleges. I am, for various odd reasons, not quite a collapse, but a sort of a sense of continual nervous exhaustion. I have reduced my hours so I'm just teaching for 40% on a number of courses, and I've set out on the rocky and as yet unsuccessful career as a writer, which is one of the reasons I'm here. So there's a bit of a self-promotion in a sense. It's a continued bit of self-promotion. It's just not, I mean, it reflects some of the research that I've done, but it also reflects me and my private enterprises. Okay, so Agents of Reason. Let's think about, first of all, the agents that I've got here. Jeremiah Joyce, he's the main character. I'm going to talk a lot about him in a minute. Working class guy. He moved through quite a lot of the different hierarchies of late Enlightenment Georgian society, and he is the main character. But there's one or two other important people to take on board. Joseph Johnson, radical publisher, published books about everybody, Wollstonecraft and Godwin and all that lot. He was a main player in the story. The Earl of Stanhope, radical Whig, brother-in-law to William Pitt. And he appears quite a lot. Our famous Tom Paine clearly worked with Jeremiah Joyce a lot, and a lot of what the story is about the publishing of Rights of Man and other things as well. Another of the radicals, John Horne-Tooke. Not quite a straight Paineite, but certainly concerned with the issue of representation through the 1780s and 90s. Thomas Hardy, the leader of the Society for Constitutional Information, one of the people who was arrested. My front cover is about Jeremiah Joyce's arrest for treasonable practices, and the treason trials of 1794 included Thomas Hardy. Another main character, John Thelwell, lecturer, activist, again one of those arrested in the same trial. So these are the agents, and then there are a section of people who were what you might call the operators in my story, at least. These were people little more genteel, little less willing to get their hands dirty in terms of direct publication, direct sort of distribution of radical literature, but nevertheless genuinely interested in reassessing the representative forms. Richard Price, Arian, Theophilus Lindsay, Unitarian, Essex Street Church, Unitarian Church, just off the Strand there, and of course Joseph Priestley. In a sense, those last three are the way the way I've got it sorted out. The story that I tell. These were the how do you put it in Smiley's people? These were the operators. These were the people who directed, but didn't actually go to the meetings for Society for Constitutional Information or the London Corresponding Society, or were actively involved in the actual printing. They were part of radical literature. They were obviously keen, but they actually had more what you might call social associations with the kind of genteel end of the Anglican Church. Okay, so why reason? So actually, we can now stop this. These are the characters, and that's all I've got to offer on that. So we can just sort of close the machine, as it were. It stops it getting hot in here. There's no more to see.
I don't guarantee this will work. It should do.
Okay. So I'll carry on, and that should stop in due course. So there are my agents. Why reason? Well, quite clearly, the end of the Enlightenment, particularly Unitarians, Reformers, and Radicals, flew the flag for reason in all matters. But this is where I personally kind of enter the story, the sort of interest I have in reason and the limits of reason. For me, there are definitions of reason, and we can go into a lot of that, but talking quite generally, we seem eminently reasonable that we live in a society where we divide things up a little bit more equitably than we do now. That's the aspiration and a sense of socialism, and that's the one to which I hold. Yet everywhere we can see the very reasonable demand for equity confounded. Within metres of where we stand, some of those houses in Bloomsbury that I've just walked by were millions, and yet there are people that have gone over to sleep and not doing very well at all. So it doesn't seem, it is as it is, and in a sense we have to accept it and get on with it and do whatever we can, but it's hardly reasonable. And when we look at some of the attempts to make life more equitable, where reason has been deployed as support in that end, let's be reasonable, it can go very wrong. We get the French Revolution, this demand for equity, or there's complex forces at least, and we get Edmund Burke, who was so very right about his predictions. It brought anarchy, brought Robespierre's guillotine, it wasn't very nice, an expansionist war, and a dictator, Napoleon. Classically, Burke got all those predictions bang on. Similarly, Lenin's project was kind of reasonable, or I've always understood it as reasonable, and then we get Stalin in the Gulag. Mao was, in a sense, initially reasonable, and then we get the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. So it seems to me that there is a limit to reason, there is a point at which reason stops, and we have to look somewhere else or think about things in a different way, because reason itself doesn't deliver the goods. One of Gandhi's famous lines was that reason, given the status of omnipotence, becomes a monster. And I think he had the spectre of the Second World War in his mind when he said that, and the Holocaust. He said that he urged his own way, which was reason on the wing of faith. Now, I don't share his faith or any other, but I am aware of the limits of mind, features of us and humanity to which reason doesn't seem to me has little access or relevance. It doesn't answer our problems. I'm not sure if that is the bit that the reason doesn't touch, in a sense, is the domain of base human need, or the spiritual, or the emotional, or maybe even unreason. But I do know, and it does seem to me from my historical study and my 57 years of life, that reason alone will not do it. It will not do enough in trying to either understand what we are or in shaping human history. So directly and indirectly, my story negotiates the limits and fortunes of reason. Thus, agents of reason. That's how I came to the title. It follows, the story does, it follows the best and most reasonable efforts of a group who act to a large extent in the name of, or at least with, the standard of reason. And in its own small way, it follows a kindling light of a certain political perspective, certainly, particularly, famously and powerfully in Paine's Rights of Man. And in its short, in the immediate history of the publication of Rights of Man, even though it was fantastically successful, it's confounding. It was, the project, the egalitarian project of Paine was snuffed out at the time. It was snuffed out by more immediate, more powerful drivers, which you might say they're immediate reasons themselves, but they were of different order. So it seems to me that there are important lessons to be learned in the fortunes of reason, and this period of the French Revolution is particularly fascinating and rich in the playing out of those different elements. In a sense, one of the benefits of history, I think, is that we are, near 200 years ago, we are sufficiently removed personally from the action, so we can maintain a bit of a distance from it. We can perhaps apprehend it a little more objectively than we can in the everyday world of now. But what is the relevance for now? I would say that the politics of left and right, probably up to about the Blair years, were formulated, or at least you can trace a lineage. You can take lineage back and back, to the Levellers and the Commonwealth men behind that. But this moment, Paine's Rights of Man, Burke's reflection. Paine writes the Rights of Man in a sense against his ex-friend's book, The Reflections, and it sets the markers for the egalitarian demand of the left on the one hand, and the preservation of order, property and the individual against the collective on the right, on the other. So in a sense it was a kind of crystallising moment where the French Revolution promised, at least to intellectual and radicals of what would become the left, a bright, more egalitarian future. This was a moment when the left rose with hope, in a sense. I'm jumbling up a whole lot of categories there, but there you go. But it rose with hope, but was snuffed out by the defensive right. But my tale, the story that's in here, is not one of great sweeping historical generalisation, although I'd hope people might be able to sort of take it and find food for that kind of debate in its pages. It's a tale based as closely as possible on the archive. It is about the detail, the humanity, the often overlooked personal drivers that make people do what they do in those circumstances. Let's think a little bit about the reception of the French Revolution. The action of the book takes place. The first page is about when George Cadogan Morgan arrives, July 16. 2 days, must have been very quick from the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille, and he got here within 2 days. At least that's what the record says. And the book ends in December, after the treason trials in 1794. So it's from July 89 to 1794. When many of my agents have been tried, and some of them, Priestley he's skipped to America. Now, when the French Revolution happened, the initial response from many Whigs across the board was kind of favourable. They assumed that the Ancien Regime would now be brought to order. Most Whigs, had a sentiment about minimising the power of the crown, and they assumed that the French Revolution would bring the French more towards the British model of the tripartite balance of the three estates: Crown, Lords, and Commons. So, and it was welcomed with open arms by reformers and dissenters, who saw promise and relief to their circumstances. If you were a dissenter, and nearly all these people were dissenters, Unitarian dissenters. You had no political representation. You were debarred from parts of the civic world through the Test Incorporation Acts. Mm-hmm. Now, Oh, God. Richard Price, who was a reformer and a dissenter, and one of my more, the puppet master agents, gave a famous speech in the Old Jury, November the 4th, and I quote that. So I use as many initial sources as I can in the book. And this was to celebrate the 1688 Glorious Revolution, in which he looked forward to the dominion of reason and conscience. He, like many others, saw the French Revolution as another step towards freedom from the 1688 Glorious Revolution, taken further by the American Revolution, and here is the French Revolution. It got more cautious, but not immediately blatantly hostile, a response from the establishment until about early summer 1790. Okay, so now in my story I want to enter Jeremiah, who we saw. He was an aspiring working class man who moved between lots of groups. Father was a wool comber from dissenting stock in Cheshunt, which is just north of the M25. Wool combers had strong guild affiliations, and they used a system for the support of journeymen. You know, a journeyman looking for work would come to the door, and there was a kind of obligation to give them food, shelter, and some money, even if there wasn't any work. So there was a kind of Jeremiah was born into a world that exercised support and responsibility for fellow tradesmen. He himself was apprenticed as a glazier not far from here in the Strand. Now his glazing was of a different sort. We didn't think of just putting windows in. It was more like a painter of glass. So it had a very artistic thing, a very scientific thing as well, because they were always trying to get the brightest blue or the brightest purple to put in their stains. And he worked for a guy who had a shop on the Strand, and it was a bit like a sort of late Georgian version of Habitat. You know, you'd go in and you'd buy a piece of glass with a bull or an Athenian image, and that would go in the hallway to your new Georgian house. And and it's a very kind of a classically Enlightenment theme. You know, that light, bathing and constructing it. So it was very much about bringing and the arranging of light into the lives of people. He probably encountered Blake. Blake was a couple of years older than him, but in the same tradition of London apprentices, to work just around the corner. He became, when he did his apprenticeship, he became a member of as a freeman of London, becomes a member of the Common Council, which was a highly charged political body, even though it had no representation in Parliament. He attended Lindsay's Unitarian Church with many of the people I put up. Here he met Johnson and Priestley and many others who would always centre and come through Essex Street. And Essex Street was a sort of a place for the distribution of radical literature. So there was lots of there would be printing, and people would arrive from, I don't know, there'd be a Unitarian minister from Maidstone in Kent or from Liverpool, and they would take a parcel of radical stuff back with them, and then they would distribute them in their various areas. It was kind of a sort of a distribution mechanism. Now, unusually for a working class man, he was taken up and supported by that community to go to Hackney College, which was then known as a sort of hotbed of radicalism. He was, which is unusual for a person who'd worked with his hands. So he was a good student, older than most, and also different. So he'd worked with his hands, whereas most were the second and third sons of more genteel families. He was also good at mathematics, which marked him out, certainly by Richard Price. And Richard Price recommended him to Lord Stanhope. That's how it came up. And it was very convenient for the dissenting community to have a close sort of organ, a mechanism for representing their interests through to a Whig aristocrat. And there's quite a sort of a set of precedents for that. Other people had done the same. So they worked as secretaries or tutors to children, and it was quite the name and label of what they actually did would move around. But it was very convenient for the dissenting community with no obvious representation in Parliament to have this voice, this channel, and that was a mechanism where they could two-way sort of source of information. So he went to work for the Earl of Stanhope in 1790 on Price's recommendation. Now, Stanhope's first wife was Hester Pitt, which was William Pitt's sister. She died, but left 3 female children, one of whom was Hester Stanhope, who was a famous traveller that made various films about her. And it's also, one of the things that's important is it's worth remembering that there's only about 20 or so aristocratic families at this time who own an immense amount of the wealth of Britain, enormous amount. And there is Jeremiah working very close to this sort of very small network of it, radical working class bloke. Now, Stanhope remarried and had 3 more children, all boys, and the link with William Pitt is very important. It's one of the dynamics of the book, but it's very important throughout, because Pitt didn't have any of his own children, and he doted on his sister's children. Also, just as if anybody doesn't know, Jeremiah was by 1787 a convinced Unitarian, not an Arian or a General Baptist. And what that meant was, following Joseph Priestley, Jesus was just a guy who God spoke to. You know, they had no truck with notions of atonement or miracles or any of that sort. But nevertheless, they were fundamental. They were getting as close to sort of a deistical position, but as you could without being deists. So I'll step back into me, because this is a form of writing. I'm a radical, socialist, aspiring working class guy. I've worked with my hands in a lot of manual jobs, and I've moved in a range of circumstances. I've been an educationalist, and Jeremiah Joyce turned out to be that after a while. And I've never felt like I fitted in. A bit like lots of us do that. I feel quite alienated, I think. So I empathise with Jeremiah in ways perhaps that other people couldn't. And I feel that in writing the book, I've had a strong need to tell his story, because it feels like there is a kind of historical eraser that's been applied to rub him out, and I think his efforts were well worth recording. I also feel like I owe him a debt. I've been researching a guy for 20 odd years. I've been in some wonderful experiences and fantastic libraries. So on a personal level, thank you, Jeremiah. Then as well, I struggle personally with some of the conventions of academic history. The overall context of what it seems to me Brit Anglo-Saxon empiricism is a context I've always struggled with, largely because of its kind of objectivist pretensions. It has a peculiarly British claim on truth, but it's often unaware of its own assumptions. It carries its own rules about what can be said, what is the order of what's important and what is not. That's not to say there are some brilliant writers, but all of them have had their own angle. Namier, Thompson, about whom I'm going to say a little more later, Aspinall, Goodwin, and lately a wonderful writer called John Barrell. All brilliant in their own way, all speaking from the confines of academia, and I needed, for me, something more personal. So this is a personal account. There is, as anybody close to me would tell you, a kind of streak in me, which is, a will to defy the dominant order, to challenge the orthodox register of academic history. I'm pretty good at that. I've upset many people along the way. And academic convention in university history departments, as great as they may be, are still conventions. Culturally established rules by means of what is said and how it is said is policed very often by values of the institution and the people doing the writing, for good or for bad. I argue that it's possible to have a more personal, more self-consciously interpretive way of doing history. And I was heavily scarred once, some 20 years ago, presenting a paper at a history conference it was Cambridge. And I've never been back to Cambridge since. Actually, I've been to the library, where it felt to me that the grand masters of history sort of listened, down to me, and I dismissed me as an upstart. So I felt that they were not reading it right and just reading things through the terms of their own pomposity. I'd written my PhD thesis, which was about Jeremiah Joyce, Radical Politics and Science Education in the 1790s. And I've written a conventional book, which came out through Ashgate. But it seemed to me there was a story to tell, and if I was really to flesh out the story, I had to consciously fictionalise the bits for which there was no hard evidence. And in so doing, I probably burnt my bridges in terms of traditional history. So I published this myself. I tried to get a publisher, I didn't try very hard, but I just had to get on with it. I had to do something and get on with it. I didn't, putting chapters of book into brown paper envelopes and sending off to people, I just couldn't live with that. I found it difficult. It's a very steep learning curve. If you publish things yourself, you reviews, exposure marketing, self-branding, all that stuff is time-consuming and not without its frustrations and vulnerabilities. But there you go. And I've not made a good success of it yet. So if you get any clues, let me know. One of the things about Jeremiah, one of the sort of intriguing but frustrating elements is the lack of record and archival evidence. And there is obvious reasons for that. One of the reasons is at the time any kind of evidence was dangerous. If you were a radical activist, keeping records of what you did in your meetings, and he, for instance, was a secretary for the Society for Constitutional Information, could be simply used by the authorities to send you to Botany Bay or hang. So people didn't keep records. What they did keep was quite formal and quite in anticipation of being read by somebody who might want to do something with it. Secondly, Joyce, like Stanhope, like so many of those people, once the French Revolution had gone really bad and we were at war by 1793, actually before then, and later on, even though they held the faith for a while, they became pretty embarrassed about it. Their nation was at war with France, and to sort of support a French cause was both dangerous, but also they did become embarrassed about what actually happened. So the end that is that they burnt Joyce had all his papers burnt on his death, 1816. So that means there's only scratchings which sort of record his passing. You really have to be a detective sleuth, going through everything in the minutest kind of way. And similarly, when Stanhope died in 1816 as well, Lord North went through the papers and burnt everything that was got political, any political side to it. And when you go down to the Stanhope records in Maidstone, in the Maidstone Kent Record Office, you can feel somebody taking out anything that has got anything political. There's only two little bits of ephemera that relate to Joyce. One was a payment in a set of accounts, and another was one of the documents that the government produced in the business of trying to try them, and in which he'd annotated. So I know his handwriting, so Lord North didn't get that bit. Thirdly, Jeremiah Joyce, he made a living later on, not with William Godwin, quite a lot, but he wrote on science. Popular science. He was part of the kind of mass educational gradualism. He made popular books for children on science, and not a popular genre. Not textbooky type things of early Newtonian versions were chucked in the bin. But actually, one of his most famous works, Jeremiah Joyce's Scientific Dialogues for the Entertainment and Instruction of Young People, it did more through the 19th century to popularize Newtonianism than anything else. It was reproduced and hacked and reproduced throughout the whole of the century. If he'd had the rights, he would have been a rich man. Furthermore, there's another bit of it. That is the business about his historical artifact and nonsense. One of the records about Jeremiah Joyce comes from a story that Hester Stanhope was in Damascus. She ended up in Damascus, and she had a doctor who attended her while she was going mad at the end of her life. And she, in her sort of wild ways, told stories about what had happened in her childhood, and Jeremiah Joyce was her tutor. So she told this story. For instance, she said when Jeremiah Joyce was arrested at in Chevening in their house down in the country. Well, it just wasn't true. And if you go to the Times, he was arrested in the house in Cavendish Square. Do you know? And so there's quite a lot of stuff which is just simply not true and apocryphal, and I'm familiar as well that there was a group of people around the action in the 1790s who sort of reappeared and wrote things down in the 1820s and 30s that were then taken up by historians towards the end of the 19th century, and they somehow became fact. So, for instance, it's almost a fact that Jeremiah Joyce went to France in 1792 to see Robespierre and all that. But actually, there's no real hard evidence for that. That's just a kind of a story that's been told, but it's sort of entered into the mythology of things. Okay. So the issue of historical evidence, and I'm sure all of you, one way or another, have grappled with that. You know, what is a historical fact? It's an E.H. Carr book. It's a nice thing to remember. So Jeremiah wasn't high profile, and that was deliberately so. He worked behind the scenes. He was a backroom boy, but he was nevertheless, he was very important in the action. And I'm sort of, so it's a bit of my anarchy. I'm quite interested in the quiet people, the people who work behind the scenes and do things. They don't often get the press or high visibility, and it's often quite, the unassuming folk who really get things happening. So one of the issues throughout writing the book is the distinction between fact and fiction. And in a sense, all writing, one way or another, has got its interpretive element. And when I now look, it's a couple of years since I wrote it, or 18 months when I finished it. I can feel the struggle that I've got in, what is the record and what I can interpret and what I can do with it. It sort of emanates through its pages, and some people pick up on that and they don't like it. Some people don't bother about it and just get on with the story. So I made the decision to fictionalise more or less as the story demanded. Now, where I have a record, for instance, Jeremiah's interrogation in front of the Privy Council, I reproduce the entire thing. But where I haven't got a record and I need a linking point, a stepping stone for the story, I made it up. I named it up on the basis of what I know about him, about the circumstances and the ideas and the practical realities of the moment. In the end, I was happy with it by and large, and I have to leave it to the reader to decide the worth of it. So I thought I'd just read a very short bit. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, just give people a flavour of it. Now, there were moments before the declaration of the war, of the war with France, when Louis' head was chopped off in 93, when the public sentiment shifted left and right. 1 minute it was Paine was getting good reviews. The next minute John Bull was winning. And this is a scene in 1792 when Stanhope and Jeremiah had been to see the Marquis de Condorcet. Condorcet was a sort of a similar sort of level and type and friend of Earl Stanhope. So they communicated with each other. And actually, that's a body of letters that got burnt, which is a real shame. If we'd had that, we'd have had some fantastic record. Okay. So, by January 1792, Thomas Hardy had set up a society dedicated to achieving fair representation in Parliament. This was the London Corresponding Society, and in the spirit of the trade guilds, he set a subscription of only a penny a week, low enough to allow most skilled working men to join. He also set no limit on the size of the membership, which meant that the society could grow and grow and grow, which it did, astonishingly. On the 25th of January, Hardy held his first meeting in the Bell Tavern, just off the Strand and 8 men paid their pennies. By the following week, there were 25 paid-up members, and new potential members were appearing all the time. By the end of March, the society numbered over 70, had debated and settled its own campaign concerns, and had opened formal correspondence with other reform societies. In April, it published an address to the public, which demanded the vote for all men and an end to parliamentary abuses of power. Throughout these few months, Horntuck helped Hardy draft constitutions, correspond with a range of groups and individuals, and write the address, which he also helped to get printed in several of the daily newspapers. Jeremiah was kept informed through regular meetings and messages left at Johnson's. He watched the progress with the nervousness of a gardener watching his seedlings. On the one hand, he was delighted, but on the other, he was apprehensive of the possible dangers that could so easily crush the life out of it. At that moment, he was one of perhaps 10 people in the world who had any awareness of the potential of this new radical voice. In Stanhope's office, they discussed each minute detail and potential consequence. Their feelings moved between the guilt of conspiracy to a certain heady exhilaration at being partial architects of the situation. Stanhope had sponsored Jeremiah and nurtured the connections that made it possible, and Jeremiah had developed those connections on the ground. They were intensely self-conscious about their roles, to the extent that they probably overestimated their real influence. Against the background of so much hostility, but with the strength of their own belief in the righteousness of their cause, the potential impact of their actions became amplified, at least in their own minds. In their more balanced moments, they thought of themselves as silent guardians of a progress that was inevitable, but in which they had their roles to play. They were haunted by Condorcet's fear, which seemed somehow to reflect or connect with Burke's warnings. Their commitment to the cause meant that they could not articulate the unnerving thought that troubled them both. Perhaps Burke was right. Might it be known that they were unleashing a monster? Might it be that they were unleashing a monster? They were moving into the unknown, and by definition, neither of them knew where they might be leading. They didn't openly discuss their fears, but the sort of self-questioning they went through meant that their projection of their unconscious concerns inhabited and structured their exchanges. In February, Paine released Part 2 of Rights of Man, which very quickly shook the foundations of the established order. He put before his audience both a revolutionary and a very attractive social plan. Old age pensions, free education and maternity allowances could be financed by an income tax in which the more you earn, the more you paid. The more you earn, the more you paid. By cutting the armed forces and the cost of central government, Britain wouldn't need as much and could therefore provide for the needs of everyone. Paine envisaged a republic which demanded the abolition of aristocratic titles and rejected the abuses of government and the king. Where Rights of Man Part 1 had been an abstract argument about rights, Part 2 was not far short of a call to arms. Paine argued that petitioning Parliament in a civilised way was futile because the immensely wealthy would never give up their immense wealth, the clear implication that the current government must be brought down. Jeremiah was now a full member of the Society for Constitutional Information and helped to guide the massive printing and distributing exercise of thousands of copies. Paine sought no royalties, and initial sales funded subsequent print runs to the extent that many copies were given away free. No book had ever reached so many hands so quickly, and no book had ever fired the political understanding of so many people, whether or not they agreed with its contents. The current of popular opinion began to run in favour of Paine. Many commentators, whilst objecting to some of Paine's more radical Republican suggestions, praised Rights of Man as a modern and practical vision. Okay, there wasn't any dialogue in that bit, which is a little bit of a shame. Okay, so that's what the book's about, really. I don't want to tell the whole story because you might not buy the book, or it might not be, but we might spoil it. But it is personal. It is self-consciously fictionalised. Some people might not like that. But there you have it. I did it. I wrote it in my caravan in southwest Scotland, looking over the Solway Firth, in 4 summers. I enjoyed it, making it. I'm reasonably pleased with its product. I'm sort of happy to sort of hawk it around in many ways. There are bits that I wish that I'd written in a different way now, but there you go. So what am I writing now? I'm writing the book that I've got on the blocks at the moment is called Tom and Edmund, Tom Paine and Edmund Burke. And it's a different kind of a play on things. Tom and Edmund came from sort of different backgrounds, and there's a really rich difference, the sort of interplay that these two guys have. Burke from Ireland and Catholicism, and Paine from Thetford and Quakerism. But their lives are so intertwined, you know. They were on the same side, really, over America. They were mates. They were like political pundits. They'd be sitting in the Strand, rather like some of the political commentators we have today, talking about politics and building bridges as well. Paine was into trying to build bridges, and Burke nearly supported him. Then the French Revolution happened, and then the two books that I've already mentioned came out, Rights of Man, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, of course, in the short term, Burke turns out to be right. It was really right. As in, we get a dictator, we get a war, and it falls to anarchy. In many ways, Paine is lucky to get away with his life. He has a really sort of interesting experience himself, arrested and nearly, he only escaped by a sheer bit of luck from the guillotine himself. So in a sense, the short term, Paine loses out the fortunes, but in the long run, the Rights of Man is, in a sense, is inspired all things civilised, all things I think call civilised, the voting system, the representative system, the idea of the welfare state, and the sense of fair play and equity. In a sense, it's Paine's version of it, but it's all in there, and most socialists, one way or another, cite Rights of Man as being, a major milestone on that. Now, one of the interesting things, though, is I've gone and looked at Burke. I come from a socialist background in which Burke, the mythology, and we all have mythologies, that I inherited was that Burke was the archetype of all things bad. You know, he was the arch Tory, and everything that I despise was embodied in it. But when you read Burke, he's a bright guy, and he plays his politics in a different way. On natural justice, he says that the function of aristocracy is to keep poor people thinking that they are happy to be poor. In one sense, he predates some of the socialist insight of 100 years later. But what he does as well is he prays his politics, not in terms of principle. It's an odd thing because he supports the Americans, he supports Indians, he does his best for Catholics, even though he can't appear to be a Catholic himself, because you couldn't be a Catholic in British politics at the time. But what he does is he says that power corrupts, and he's kind of right, and it kind of fits and challenges my socialist principles all the way through. So what I've got on the books at the moment is Tom Paine's and there's some wonderful biographies, Keen's biography particularly, of that, and I'm sort of telling the biographical sort of features of that. I don't know if you know, but Tom Paine, in his early years, worked for 6 months as a privateer. He was waiting for boats to come towards the French coast, which were looted, and he made quite a bit of money. He actually survived for something like 4 or 5 months in London on the profits of a share of booty. So I'm interested in these contradictions and the compromises that we actually have to engage with in life, and I suppose there I am. I am a socialist, and I do think and I still think it's a good idea to be a socialist, but there I am in white, male, middle-class University of York, supporting the system. So it's sort of the contradictions that he lived with and thought about, sort of echoed in my life as well. Okay, so in a sense he plays his politics in a different way, and what I'm doing in that book is taking those different biographical sort of features and then carrying on the story right up into the Blair years, which will be extracts of the fortunes of these two guys and their different perspectives of the traditional Tory Labour opposition that you would have, I think, began to be completely disappear when Blair et al. Had to sell out for power, had to sell out to the Southeast Power Bloc. That's my reading of it. So that's what I've got on the line. Just before I finish, I thought I'd say just something about E.P. Thompson, because I know you're going to be talking about him. Now I've got 3 dog-eared copies of Thompson's book. I use, and when I'm doing, when somebody comes in front of you, a name comes in front, you look under various sources, and one of the classic sources is always that book. It's a great source and a great book. But what do I think about its Marxist narrative? Well, I have to admit that I'm ambiguous. Thompson's narrative appears to me as a kind of a heroic tale in which the actors fulfil their roles against shifts in the capitalist order. Now, I agree with the Marxist analysis of capital. It seems to me it's true today as it was when Marx was writing, but it seems to me that Thompson's Marxism leads him to read the action, the human action, the close action, with all its vagaries and competing drivers and compromises, in too tight, too reductionist a kind of a way that leaves little space for the autonomous and local action of the people involved. That is the compromises and contradiction that they are involved in. He applies this frame so much, even though he gets some fantastic sources, but he reads it all with this frame that I think limits. He ends up with a kind of romantic tale that in his commitment to tell it the Marxist way, misses out what I think the real agency, with all its dirt and grit and difficulty and compromise. He lets down. Now, don't get me wrong, he does champion working people, and I like that, as against other historical accounts which more or less miss them out. But he read them in Marxist terms, which seems to me to miss something essential out of the equation.